be your cue. Sorry about that.
Yes.
All right, so I will start with the second slide itself, since most of you heard what I said with the first slide before. So the polar bear standing on the last sheet of ice in the distant North Pole. This picture, along with the headline, "Be Worried, Be Very Worried," splashed on 3rd April 2006 on the cover of Time magazine, as well as the National Geographic and Wildlife magazines, which had covers with a polar bear with headlines saying "The Polar Vortex," "Global Warming," "Arctic Meltdown." The polar bear, in all its pure white and noble appearance, was appealing to the inhabitants of the entire planet, standing forlornly with its habitat endangered and no other place to migrate to. The subtle messages screamed loud through this frame. Around this frame, the impact of climate change was meant to be conveyed to the world. The critical role of the centrality that mainstream media or newspapers and magazines played in the understanding of climate change can be interpreted in 3 distinct layers. First, it was meant to highlight the role played by the governments in combating the problem collectively. Second, it directed attention towards susceptible regions, flora and fauna, as well as indigenous communities that were most affected by the ravages of climate change. And third, the projection of people who were emerging as green warriors, championing for the cause of the environment through their activism and solutions that they offered on the field. The next slide, please. So scholarship on news coverage of climate change has focused largely on the United States and Western Europe. Climate skepticism, which is predominantly the narrative in these countries, is not necessarily the case in developing economies. In Asia, the continent which will face the brunt of climate change due to its population density, the narrative has been restricted to coverage during calamities or major international environment summits. My research not only draws attention toward the present research that's occurring in climate change coverage by the media, but also critically examines the role played by media to shape the discourse for government and non-governmental organizations to set the agenda. And hence, this book that I've brought out appeals to media and climate change scholars, journalists, policymakers, and scientists to stop being mere spectators in this discourse, but become active producers in the creation of news. This could be through a role of a climate action warrior by continuously and consistently bringing out the messaging in the media and thereby shaping media coverage towards more proactive narratives rather than the doomsday narrative. The next slide, please. The state of media coverage, you can see, is about setting the agenda and about the discourse that the public really wants to read. The purpose of writing this book is first to draw attention to the fact that reporting of climate change is not only a complex issue, but it is also a very significant issue. So how should the media be covering this issue? Should the newspaper hide the report somewhere in between, or should it warrant front page coverage? Should it be screaming out loud to the readers? Coverage of such matters, especially in press narratives, can have direct policy implications. The coverage of protests, activism can directly or indirectly show how political elites, policymakers, and local administration evaluate interests and how these can become success stories. The voice of the public can serve as an opinion, as a barometer when it reaches government agencies through this mainstream coverage by the media. Next slide, please. Second, it has implications on policy matters. Who is benefiting from this narrative and who is losing out is critical to examine. Here, the onus is on media houses and journalists themselves to produce and disseminate facts to the key stakeholders in a balanced and fair manner. Finally, it is interesting to analyze how climate change communication is dissected amongst the different stakeholders, whether they are scientists, communities, media, and policymakers themselves, and how all these people kind of engage in this discourse. The use of the 5-year media coverage of the Western Ghats as a macrocosm of climate change complexities serves as an eye-opener to make sense of the vast and rich biodiversity that exists in India, and how India has been trying to improve its economy after freeing itself from colonial rule in 1947. Asian countries are facing the brunt of climate change as they struggle to toe the line between the path of development, growth, while adhering to COP protocols. And so the underlying concept of my work is to highlight the significance played by the media in either downplaying or overly highlighting the communication of climate change. Next slide, please. The next one. Next. Yeah. So here's a headline from the Times of India that screamed out that India is amongst the 5 worst hit by climate change in 2018. So, in trying to understand how does the media co-produce news, what importance does it attach to news related to climate change? And what factors are at play while editorial decisions are taken either to project or to downplay a certain event or a phenomenon? And how does this mediated discourse balance corporate interests while tackling scientific evidence? And why does a COP summit have themes that communicate an overarching message? So it was very interesting to also listen to what Ona was saying, because I'll be talking about the COP summits and how political agendas are set and how that displays an overarching messaging in the way in which a particular country pushes forward its agenda and then says that, look, all our discourse should be aligned towards that agenda. Next slide, please. So I looked at these 2 newspapers, which is the Deccan Herald and the Times of India, and kind of looked at the coverage of 5 years and about 550 articles. And I did a content analysis, I did a quantitative content analysis, and looked for themes or frames and rhetorical devices that the media used to convey about this. And what was also interesting about this study was, while I looked at these articles over that 5-year period, I also looked at doing focus group discussions amongst indigenous communities that were settled in that region in Western Ghats, where a lot of economic activity was taking place. So if you see in the next slide, there is a video, and you can just play that video as well. There's no audio for that video. So home to around 50 million people, the Western Ghats consists of 4,000 villages, and you know that India is a land of villages, right? And it is spread across many, many states in the Western Peninsula of India over a distance of about 1,500 kilometers, with peaks ranging from 1,000 to 2,500 meters. And it gets copious amount of rainfall ranging from 80 to 320 centimeters on an average, and is the source of major river systems, including the Kaveri, Krishna, Godavari rivers, as well as it's a place where a lot of cash crops grow that India exports as well. According to documented reports, the Western Ghats cover barely 5% of India's forest area, but it is home to 1,800 species endemic to the region and consists of 27% of all species of higher plants recorded in the Indian region. A significant amount of industries and resources are found along the Western Ghats, which pass through the states of Maharashtra, Goa, Karnataka, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu. The Western Ghats was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 2012. The Karnataka government constituted 2 expert panel committees to give recommendations on the scope and area of development after the ecologically sensitive areas were earmarked following the tag given by UNESCO. This resulted in a political unrest, protests, since crores of rupees, millions of rupees were at stake for projects that would have to be shelved. indigenous communities living inside the forest were asked to evict, and their livelihoods were on the verge of being wiped away as these forests are now protected reserves. If you see in my next slide, I have brought out excerpts from the book where I talk to these communities, and this is what they say. So there's something that's come into force called the Forest Rights Act, which allows these indigenous communities now to go into the forests and collect the produce that they eke a livelihood from, so that they can continue to do what they were doing for centuries. And in the next slide, again, you will see that, how the perception of climate change, which was occurring right in the forest close to where these indigenous communities lived, is viewed from their lens. But when I asked them, what do you understand about climate change? Most of them said, oh, we watch it on television, and it is when there's a deluge of rainfall in the capital city, which is Bangalore, where the roads get flooded and the traffic comes to a standstill. That for us is climate change. So imagine the powerful visuals that the media is giving out can have so much of an impact on these marginalized or indigenous communities that they perceive climate change to be something that's happening in the bigger cities because of the way in which the media focuses its coverage, rather than on observing these aspects which are occurring quite close home to them and which will have serious implications on their livelihood, on their health. It'll have serious implications in the way in which they will eventually think about migrating to the cities, and it will also create a very uneven distribution of the way in which economics is played out on a larger scale as well. So in the next slide, you can see that this was how I collected my data. I kind of looked at a 5-year coverage, and the narratives show a range of themes and topics covered on how the Times of India and the Deccan Herald, two major national broadsheets in India, covered this Western Ghats. So that's a small snapshot of one's range of the Western Ghats. In my next slide, you can see really how the distribution of the articles has taken place. So we kind of looked at different types of articles. So, a news report mainly is just a 100 or a 250 word report, which is relegated somewhere in the inside pages, and it is mostly from an official source. Whereas a feature talks about the issues of environmental concerns, whereas an investigative piece is looking at what vested interests are doing there. Are they breaking the rules? Are they breaking the law? Are they doing something? Are they constructing a hydropower project in a green area? Has a new educational institution come up in a green zone? So these are investigative pieces, and these are much required that the media does them, but you can see how small or how minimal they are. And analytical essays, again, were bare minimum. These analytical essays were written by very popular environmentalists, policy writers, writers who contribute to the IPCC reports. And then infographics. In today's day and age, infographics need to speak out loud because a picture is worth 1,000 words, but that was lacking. And also editorial, how a newspaper chooses to take its stance. That there were hardly any editorials in both the newspapers, as well as travel and adventure related articles. So if you see the next slide, it talks about this aspect as well, that Deccan Herald published a lot more reports compared to the Times of India. Analytical essays and infographics were given more attention in the Times of India, maybe because of the kind of readers who read the Times of India. Deccan Herald has more regional editions coming out, and maybe that's why they didn't think that their readers would understand infographics better, more in the hinterland of the country. And feature and investigative pieces have a proportionate ratio in both the newspapers, indicating that both are publishing facts and regularly covering news related to this issue. So I'll let you skip the next two slides because we've covered that. Yeah, you can skip that and the next slide. Yeah, we'll stop here. We'll pause on this slide, and just to give you an idea that this is how infographics were covered in the newspaper. So it had a glimpse of what are the areas earmarked, what are the suggestions in these ecological sensitive areas, mining. So mining is huge in these areas, that all current mining activities have to be phased out in the next 5 years. No permission for thermal projects. Hydropower projects may be allowed, but with riders. All red category industries to be banned, villagers to be involved in decision making on projects, tourism hotspots to be monitored for compliance. So all these things came under the ambit of these new policy decisions. And as you can see, it has huge economic implications, and that's why there's a lot of conflict, with regard to the tagging of this World Heritage Site in the Western Ghats. So the next slide is giving a glimpse of today, how a lot of infographics, there is an increase. So when I did the study 2012 to 2017, there was less of visual coverage, but today you can see that climate change is for real. And then there are a lot of interesting things that happen on Twitter. And so the narrative has also become more broader, not confined to mainstream, in the sense it's not mainstream media as such. It's you can even have a podcast, you can have a blog. Climate activists can start their own media multimodal way of disseminating information. So newspapers, which traditionally were the gatekeepers of information, which I showed in the earlier part of my research, is no longer the case. There is an increase in the way in which other multimodal ways of communicating about climate change have emerged. So in my next slide, I talk about how the relevance of media coverage to the policy imbroglio that currently plagues the Western Ghats, is relevant, because selective use of attributes can affect the evaluation of an issue. So if the media is constantly framing this issue in terms of from a problem-centered approach, from a doomsday narrative, it will impact the way in which policy-related decisions are also taken. And if the people who are affected in those areas if their voices are not taken into account, then it will result in the continuation of those projects that are taking place in that ecologically sensitive area. So therefore, the use of these attributes, the use of rhetorical devices can affect the evaluation of such an issue. So in my next slide, I discuss about why media coverage really matters, because I separate the word journalists, editors, and media owners, because they all have to work in unison if the role has to come across very loud and clear. They all have to work in tandem with each other. They all have to have a common goal. Otherwise, the coverage becomes very fragmented, like we just saw in terms of the types of articles that they write about. And there is no consistency. The narrative is very fragmented. It doesn't convey much about the importance that they attribute to covering climate change. The role of the media must shift from disaster narratives to developing solutions. And journalists are faced with challenges from a range of actors, whether it's on the field, in the corridors of power, or even inside their own establishments. The next slide talks about how the media can demonstrate a key role in shaping the core discourse on climate change through frequent communication about the public perception and the policy agenda. And so therefore, the media must invest in specialized coverage. And last two months, at least, from the time in December when the COP26 summit happened, I can see in the Indian media, at least, I can see this happen where specialized coverage is taking place on a Sunday, on a weekend, and there is a focus towards disseminating information connected to climate change, and that's a good sign to see very recently. But that's happened very recently. And in the next slide, I just again give a glimpse or a snapshot of the data that I collected, and you can see the peaks in the coverage occur, and these peaks are really occurring during major events like the Paris summit or a COP summit. And that is when a lot of world leaders come together and they give out, interesting keywords like carbon neutral, net zero. And so then the coverage peaks in those times. And in the next slide, if you see how, in the global scenario, the world newspaper coverage of climate change or global warming has taken place, you can also see similar peaks during these massive treaties, where world leaders converge. In my next slide, I just have one more slide, and I just want to, talk about what we should do now, because I feel that, the present generation of the millennials, they have this concept of eco-grief, and this concept of eco-grief means that they feel that there's nothing they can do, that we are handing them a planet which is irreparable or irreversible. And so there is a kind of a demotivation amongst these youngsters. So we need to think about how do we build the next generation of climate leaders, whether it is passing down, knowledge systems which scientists have accumulated through climate modeling, through, the basic fundamental sciences that a lot of scientists are doing, or whether it is, transitioning the ideas to the next generation of business leaders or the next generation of communicators. We need to build the next generation. Otherwise, we will lose this knowledge that we have so far built, and it will be very difficult for them to cope with the way in which, the climate change or the pace at which climate change is occurring. Secondly, we need to become, as scholars, we need to become more publicly engaged. We need to contribute to policy. We need to be there in those, we need to be seen and heard in those key action reports when they occur, and we need to interact more with businesses, with social scientists, with climate scientists, instead of working in silos. And I also emphasize these points when I was recently called to talk at a climate change conference, which was organized by a fundamental science institute. I talked about this because, we have to not work in silos. We have to do more, discussive, initiatives, so that we kind of, come out of these, isolated workspaces that we are in. And we need to also be proactive in networking when there is an upcoming COP summit, when there is a release of an IPCC report, when, we have to speak at relevant forums to align this discussion so that the messaging of our country gets out there loud. And in the next slide, I kind of highlight that, a study of US media coverage of COP23 found that climate change stories lead into wider considerations of attention paid to political content of coverage. And when world leaders converge and the media coverage peaks, so the role of journalists there becomes highlighted again. And climate change is a pressing issue of our times, and it warrants equal action from citizens, government, and media. Communicating this to the government and citizens and bridging the divide is a critical role that media has to take cognizance of. Therefore, I think that however bigger the challenges to influence policy decisions and the public by shaping information dissemination about climate change, breaking down complex scientific terms, estimate that climate change can be, broken down into solvable components that can be synthesized by the public, and it need not be a challenge for the media. Climate change reporting is largely driven by two forces: a path-breaking scientific breakthrough and a major policy decision impacting the lives of the people. And therefore, official sources dominate the coverage. So finally, we have to think about convincing the public to take steps to mitigate climate change. And throughout my study, I found that, this was the most widely used rhetorical device by journalists. So the last slide really talks about that, given that, climate change is here to stay. We need to enable the media to assume a greater role in connecting climate science to policy decisions. Finally, the results point towards journalistic biases based on their own organizational or national influences on media content. In maintaining the balance between conservation efforts and development, climate journalism must interact and complement these different factors to ultimately empower the public to become a part of the solution and the policy-making process. So with that, I'll stop the presentation and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me just stop recording.